Morning, good day, everyone. Good afternoon. We are going to start the webinar soon. Just going to wait for a few more participants to come in. Great. I think we can start. So my name is Victor Diaz, and I'm the Communications and Capacity Building Manager at the ECLT Foundation, and I'm delighted to be your moderator today. I would like to welcome you to this webinar titled A Decade of Commitment, reflecting on our pledge and exploring a collective pathways. We have planned today an exciting and interactive session to commemorate the 10th anniversary of ECLT's Foundation members' Pledge of Commitment, a landmark agreement signed on December 10th, 2014, to combat child labor through robust policies, due diligence, and remediation aligned with the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So our agenda today, we will have a keynote speech from Michiel Reading, the president of the ECLT board. Also, Innocent Muwawa, the executive director of the ECLT Foundation, is going to give us a history of the pledge of commitment. Then Megan Pacey, the Knowledge and Learning Director at the International Cocoa Initiative, is going to take us through collective action to tackle child labor and forced labor in cocoa. Then we will have testimonial videos from the ECLT board members. And then we will have a roundtable discussion based on 3 specific questions that our panelists, Innocent and Megan, are going to answer to. Then we'll open the floor for an interactive Q&A session, and then we will close the webinar with the road ahead. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Michiel, and the president of the ECLT board.
Victor, as the president of the board, it is both a great privilege and a great responsibility to speak to you today as we mark 1 decade since the signing of the ECLT members' Pledge of Commitment. Over the past 10 years, this pledge has united us in a shared mission, the elimination of child labor in tobacco growing communities and the protection of children's rights across agricultural supply chains. The journey we embarked upon 10 years ago was unprecedented, and today we can proudly reflect on the tangible progress that we have made. 100% of pledge signatories now have robust policies in place to eliminate child labor. Child labor due diligence systems, critical for identifying and addressing risks, are operational in 80% of our member organizations. And remediation practices, a cornerstone of the pledge, are now supported by 80% of our signatories, ensuring swift action when child labor is identified. Furthermore, through strategic collaborations, we have implemented industry-wide agricultural labor practice codes and provided training for independent, non-contracted growers. This work has strengthened policy frameworks and empowered communities in Zimbabwe, Malawi, Tanzania, and Indonesia. This progress underscores the power of collective action. Together, we have elevated standards and practices, influencing not only our sector, but also broader agricultural supply chains. Initiatives such as operational grievance mechanisms are now established in 74 countries and are emblematic of our commitment to accountability and to continuous improvement. Still, as we celebrate these milestones, we recognize the challenges that remain. Child labor persists as a complex and systemic issue, demanding our unwavering focus. The roadmap for the next 10 years of the pledge charts a bold path forward with very clear priorities. Establishing a universal standard of prohibited tasks for children in tobacco farming. Supporting efforts to achieve living incomes for growers and their families. And expanding cross-sector collaborations to tackle child labor at scale. These priorities will guide us as we strive for a world where every child is free from the burden of child labor and where every child is able to realize their full potential. In closing, I want to acknowledge the unwavering dedication of our signatories, partners, and the communities we serve. All these efforts are a testament to what we can achieve together. And let us use this moment not just to reflect, but to reaffirm our commitment to the principles of the pledge and to build upon the foundation we have laid. Thank you for your continued partnership and for your belief in this mission. Together, let us shape a future where every child enjoys their fundamental right to a safe and fulfilling childhood. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for that very insightful and strong message. We fully agree with the fact that accountability and transparency are very essential pillars of what we're doing with the pledge, and we will come back to those discussions later at the roundtable discussion. I would like to give the floor now to Innocent Muwawa, the Executive Director of the ECLT Foundation. Innocent, please take us through the history of the pledge of commitment. Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure and honor to be able to share the history of the ECLT board members' pledge of commitment. This process started 10 years ago, but it is also important as we are celebrating the 10th anniversary to reflect on where did we start from, why did we start from there, what were some of the challenges that we encountered, and how did we overcome them. This is could be an important lesson for other commodities, for other sectors that may want to explore having a pledge of commitment as part of their efforts to address labor and human rights issues in their supply chains. Next slide, please, Victor. So the ECLT pledge of commitment, its roots go back to, recall that in 2011, the UNGPs had been unanimously adopted by the United Nations Human Rights Council. So in 2012, as it happened, the ECLT board, we had a field board meeting in Tanzania, where, among other things, the board members spent some time in the field interacting with growing communities, the farmers, the children, in areas where tobacco is grown in a region called Tabora in Tanzania. They were able to see firsthand some of the good practices that are happening, but also some of the challenges which the small-scale tobacco growers are facing. When we reconvened after the field visit, the board members started asking themselves, how come we're able to see some farmers who are just so well off, doing very well, and some who are not doing so well at all? How can we close this gap? How can we make sure that we are continuously improving the standards on the farms? What can we agree as board members is a minimum standard or commitment of how we are addressing child labor issues in the various communities? So that's where the conversation about the pledge of commitment started. The board basically said, we are a club of people who have joined the foundation. But what are our rules? What is the dress code? what do we observe? What is really binding us besides the contribution that we pay to the ECLT Foundation? So in 2013, the consultation started for the development of the Pledge of Commitment, and it was signed in 2014 on the 10th of December. That's why today it is the 10th anniversary celebration. Since then, we did a baseline survey in 2015 just to get a clear understanding of where are the various members of the ECLT Foundation with respect to their child labor policies? Where are they? Where are they with respect to their due diligence processes? Where are they with respect to remediation measures if child labor is found in their supply chain? So it gave us a baseline of to better understand what the situation was, what the gaps were, and possibly then also work towards closing those gaps. And then we issued a public communication, which we shared with the whole world on where the industry was, demonstrating the sector's commitment to transparency. In 2018, we did another survey. Then in 2024, we've just completed another one where we have taken stock of where we are now, but also reflected on the journey that the collective progress over the past 10 years, while also casting a vision of the future. Where are we going to go? Where is the next challenge with regards to the pledge? Next slide. So the pledge itself, we wanted to make sure that it was rooted in the international law and international standards. So besides, of course, making sure it was aligned with the UNGPs, the ILO fundamental conventions and so forth, we wanted to make sure that it was informed by stakeholder views and expert opinion. So we consulted the tobacco companies that are signatories themselves. We consulted UN organizations, civil society organizations, including trade unions, including growers associations. And you can see there some of the concerns for each of those stakeholders. Tobacco companies were worried that an agreement of this nature may go against antitrust laws. They were also very cognizant and worried that they operate in various markets where sometimes the national law might not agree with international law. How were we going to handle such situations? The UN organizations that we consulted were, of course, more interested in making sure that the pledge was aligned with international law. So we sent the document to them, they reviewed it and sent it back to us. We incorporated their inputs in the design, in the wording of the pledge. The UN organizations were also interested, of course, in that balance between national law and international law, and what do we do when there is conflict. Then civil society organizations, similar concerns, but growers associations, when we did the consultations, were saying, we also want the cost of production that the pledge of commitment, the signatories also agree to say no one must pay below the cost of production. So they wanted that included in the pledge of commitment. Next slide. So with regards to antitrust issues, I think where we landed was that that's why you don't find any reference to prices, wages, or costs of production in the pledge document, because that would really go against antitrust laws. But we also knew that within the tobacco sector, there is something called good agricultural practices, where the issues of cost of production are already covered. So we said, okay, this is already taken care of under some other industry standards. So we don't need to go there in the pledge because of antitrust laws. And therefore, we need to agree on what needs to be done, what are the broad principles, rather than on how to implement those principles. Can we go next slide? With regards to international law versus national law, you see that some companies, especially those that are based in the United States, the United States has not ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. It has not ratified the ILO Convention 138 on the minimum age. On the minimum age. And the US Constitution, in particular, it gives certain rights to indigenous communities, Native American communities, the roles that children of those indigenous peoples are allowed to perform at household level. So because of that, the US-based companies could not agree to a pledge that was going against those national laws. So you will see that in the pledge, sometimes we use, instead of saying we recognize or we recognize the UNCRC, we chose words like we acknowledge the UNCRC. So we had armies of lawyers looking through this document to make sure that the pledge was positioned appropriately, recognizing all these differences between, sometimes conflicts between national and international law. Next. So the cost of production, I've already mentioned that when we are talking child labor, cost of production is very central to addressing child labor. But so the growers associations wanted something included in the pledge, more or less asking all companies to pledge not to pay below the cost of production. And for the reasons I explained, that is not covered in the pledge, but is included in other instruments that are used in the tobacco sector. Next slide. Another discussion was, what is the role of the ECLT Foundation in the implementation of the pledge? If you look at current regulations that are all coming up, as we know, across the world, they place a lot of importance also on multi-stakeholder initiatives, industry multi-stakeholder initiatives. And they see us, the likes of ICI, who are in the room, and ourselves as ECLT Foundation, as helping to support the implementation of regulations, laws such as the CSDDD. But should the multi-stakeholder initiative be a police, or should it be a teacher and a supporter for the members who are implementing the pledge? And the agreement there was, the platform like us has a very important role for the pledge in, number one, ensuring that there are meaningful stakeholder consultations. For example, that's how we're able to bring in the perspectives of the UN, growers associations, and so forth. We have an important role to play in awareness raising and making sure that there's mutual understanding of accountability of what that pledge means, making sure there's cross-sectoral learning and scaling up of good practices, capacity building, and then verification of communication of progress as we go through the process of implementation. Next slide. Then lastly, what does impact look like? When we are talking about the pledge, if the pledge is effective, where do we see the impact? Do we look at the child or the tobacco farmer? Or do we look at the company that has signed the pledge of commitment? And so it became an issue of, okay, how do we measure the impact? How do we make sure that this pledge has teeth and that it is actually useful? And so the discussion was, okay, what is that unit of analysis if we want to measure impact? And the agreement was, the pledge's impact is on companies. It is an agreement by companies who are members of the ECLT Foundation. Therefore, when you want to measure the impact of the pledge, you look at the companies. Of course, we know that if companies are good at integrating the pledge in their policies and procedures and their remediation measures, we will see a very good impact at the level of the child and farmers. But the first place of measurement of the impact of the pledge is the company itself. Then we also agreed that we have to be always mindful that the implementation of the pledge is a process of continuous improvement. There is no destination. It's like democracy. You will never reach a point of perfection. You have to continue working on it and improving it. And so even the report that we are launching today, you will still see certain gaps. But we are happy with that as long as we are showing that we are continuously improving. Now, when we look at all this that has happened over the past 10 years, next slide, Victor, please. When we look at all the lessons that have been learned from the past 10 years, I think what I can mention two things that come to mind. The development of a sector-wide commitment for those sectors that might want to follow the path of ECLT, which we really encourage. You should know that it is a slow process. And sometimes it can be a messy process because of some of the concerns and issues that I raised that you hear from various stakeholders. But so in a way, it is like the making of a sausage. The process is very messy, but the product that you get is very good. The process can be slow, but what you will get in terms of the resultant commitment, you cannot trade that for anything else. So it is slow, but it will get you in the right place. The UNGPs, of course, positioned in the pledges we did with ECLT, they really gave the ECLT members a head start. Before we had even talking about all these regulations, CS-DDD or this mandatory legislation in France or in Netherlands, the members had already started integrating these in their supply chains. They had already started being assessed on these issues. So the industry, they had head start before these things were even made mandatory. Hopefully, as the regulations are becoming mandatory, they are already way ahead in terms of ensuring compliance. So to conclude, 10 years of history, 10 years of progress. We know that there's a lot of ground to be covered, as Mikel has said, but we are also very hopeful. And what gives us hope is that the pledge shows us that companies can change, can improve, can commit, and they are committed. So that gives us hope that a future agriculture without child labor, it is possible. But it also gives us hope that instead of going via individual commitments, the companies in ECLT came up with a joint commitment. This way, yes, it meant that we moved slower, but I think it means that we actually can go further by working together. So sometimes speed and distance do not always match. I think going forward, first with a situation where we are going to be missing SDG 8.7 to eliminate all forms of child labor by end of 2025, given that we'll miss this target, we have no alternative than say, let's go for working together so that we can go further. Thank you so much, Victor. Thank you for giving me the floor.
Thank you, Innocent, for this very insightful overview on how the stakeholders were consulted and how the role of ECLT was defined and how we're measuring impact of the measures that we're putting into place throughout the pledge for the past 10 years. And obviously the lessons learned as well. And I'm also taking the analogy of that it is messy as making of a sausage. But in that sense, I'm going to give the floor to Megan Pacey, who is going to explain how collective action to tackle child labor and forced labor in cocoa. So I can give you the control, Megan, and please go ahead. think you're muted.
There we
Yes.
go. By giving me control, I lost my ability to control my microphone. But
Okay.
thank you very much for having me, and it's great to be here. I'm going to talk about actually quite a similar process that happened a little bit more recently from ICI, but it's excellent to hear from Innocent about how ECLT have been really trying to go about tackling very similar challenges to what we at ICI have been trying to do. So most of you will know who ICI are already, so this is probably a little bit of repetition, but if you I still can't. Oh, yes, I can. Sorry. So ICI is also a multi-stakeholder organization. We unite the forces of civil society, certifiers, and the cocoa and chocolate industry, as well as international organizations, to address child labor and forced labor, specifically in the cocoa sector. So as you know, cocoa is grown in sometimes the same, but often different areas to tobacco. So our global focus is a little bit more specifically on West Africa, although of course cocoa is grown elsewhere too. And we have this interesting mixture of both industry and civil society who are supposed to be working together to make the kinds of changes that we want to see in relation to children's rights. So I'm sorry, but I still can't actually control the screen. Thank you very much. You probably know this already, but child labor in cocoa is particularly focused in West Africa. We have around 38% of children in child labor in cocoa growing areas of Côte d'Ivoire and around 55% in Ghana, making an estimated total of about 1.56 million child laborers in cocoa in Côte d'Ivoire and in Ghana as of 2020. ICI's main focus is actually twofold. It's both child labor and forced labor. But in order to keep things simple and give a kind of concrete example in relation to our pledge, I'm going to focus more on the child labor today. Not unique to cocoa, but of course there are cocoa-specific drivers to this, many of which are similar in terms of the tobacco sector too. So I won't go into that in more detail now. Next slide, please. So how have ICI approached making member commitments? Well, until 2020, ICI was doing operations, ICI's members were doing various different programs to prevent and address child labour. And as part of the redefinition of our strategy for 2021 to 2026, we also entered into a process which sounds very similar to the ECLT pledge. So this is what I'm going to talk about right now. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Essentially, for the first time in this new strategy, ICI made a strategic commitment on behalf of all its members for the first time. So previously, we'd been reporting on what ICI was doing as a foundation, using the money of our members, but not taking into account the efforts that may have been being made by our members in addition to this. So we and our members decided together that rather than looking at what ICI is doing as a foundation in a vacuum, rather we would try to say, how can we account for all the members all the efforts of all the members being made collectively? So we have several strategic objectives and very clear commitments within this new strategy. And one of those was about the scale up of effective systems to prevent and address child labour, with the very concrete aim of reaching 100% of cocoa growing households in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana with these systems to prevent and address child labour. So concretely, these are not only CLMRS, child labour monitoring remediation systems, but in reality, this is the most common type of approach being used by our members. And so I'll be focusing on that today. So this was the commitment. The next question is, how on earth are we going to measure it? So next slide, please. So as a quick reminder, CLMRS are very much child-centered support systems that provide a mixture of support and awareness raising. They monitor and identify child labour, and then they follow up with cases. So to understand how children are doing over time and to provide them additional support. And they're really a type of child labour due diligence system that responds to the main steps in the OECD guiding principles, or the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidance in terms of how to implement them. So it's one quite common approach to preventing and addressing child labour, but it's not the only one. So this was the challenge. How can we measure this? Since this was the very common intervention type that was being increasingly used. Next slide, please. So as part of the ambitions to do this, we decided that we needed to hear from our members on a regular basis about how they were doing in relation to this commitment. So not every single one of our members has separately made a commitment to covering 100% of their supply chain, but as an ICI membership as a whole, we are aiming for this 100% target. So if you go to the next slide, please. The aim was to introduce a member reporting requirement. This was something that hadn't happened before then, but it's been obligatory for all members now since 2021. It happens on an annual basis based on a set of jointly agreed indicators, and the reporting takes place through an online platform. It sounds very similar in many ways to the self-assessments that ECLT have been doing, just a little bit more often. And then based on the data that we get, we publish on an annual basis those aggregated results. So one of the things in terms of challenges, and I can talk about that a little later, is to make sure that, of course, there's a great degree of sensitive information, which is both collected and held by the various companies, but also civil society members, which shouldn't necessarily make it to the public domain. So the advantage of using a multi-stakeholder platform to be able to aggregate this data is that we can add it all together and present these are the results of ICI members as a whole, without necessarily shedding the spotlight on a particular member for whom doing this on their own might be sensitive. So next slide, please. This is the process, very briefly. So every year, usually starting in January, our members receive training and resources. And then for a month, our members enter their data via an online form. ICI then compiles and analyzes that data. We discuss the preliminary results together during one of our board meetings, and then later that year, those joint results are published. At the same time, we also provide for every member who reported a fact sheet summarizing the data that they reported it and comparing it to either the overall totals or the average results, so that they can also have a sense of how they're doing in relation to ICI membership as a whole. And these are strictly kept between our members and each other, but it's been a very useful tool to encourage, validate efforts that are being made, but also encourage performance to improve year on year. Next slide, please. So what have been some of the challenges? And you'll see in this list that they'll be very similar in many ways to what Innocent was mentioning. So obviously encouraging and supporting all members to report has not always been easy. Equally, the ability to ensure adequate safeguards and protections for the data shared. Another challenge has been ensuring the quality of the data that's reported, and I imagine this is something you sometimes struggle with too. But one of the things that's been key in that is making sure that we have a common understanding and key definitions that are really clear and well understood by everybody. And equally creating sustaining confidence in the process. It's one thing to say this is a requirement, it's another thing to encourage 40 or so members to actually fill out the form in the required time frame with usable data. So these have been some of the things we've struggled with. If you click again, some of the solutions. So how did we encourage and support those members to report? First of all, we made it obligatory because we thought that this would be an easier way of making sure that everybody does it. It wasn't optional, it was obligatory. And equally, we've provided a lot of support, some for some members more than others who've needed it, but to really make sure that everybody has the required tools, material, and an understanding of what's expected of them to be able to do that. The safeguards part has been really key, especially in terms of the sensitive nature of the data that we provide, or that we collect rather. So one of the key data points that companies report to us is, for example, the number of children identified in child labour in their supply chain, which obviously is quite a sensitive piece of data that while some companies do already publish that, many don't. So we had to make sure that we signed a separate non-disclosure agreement with every single member before the reporting started, which took a very long time. But also that we made sure that where the data was collected and stored in this online platform, adequate safeguards were in place to make sure that it could only be accessed by a very, very limited number of people, even within ICI. So I think there are currently 2 people within ICI that get to see that data and nobody else, to give you an idea of how careful we have to be about that. And then equally, very clear rules have been made for which data points will we publicly report, how will we publicly report on them. Let's say we only got a limited number of people reporting on a single data point. How many minimum members would we need to be able to then share an aggregated answer? And all these questions came up, and we had to find solutions to each one of them. In terms of data quality, of course, having an agreed set of indicators took some time to negotiate, but was a really important step for us in ensuring ownership of those data points and making sure that what people wanted to report was in there, as well as what we thought needed to be in there, providing then clear definitions and allowing training and support. And then, as I mentioned, these individual fact sheets have been a really helpful way of being able to provide individual feedback to each member one by one, to explain how we think they're doing and how we can help them to improve for next year. And then finally, for the last 2 years, we've also had an independent external audit. So that happens on an annual basis now, so that we have limited assurance of the entire reporting process. And that means that what can be published has all been audited to make sure that we as ICI have been doing our job in terms of adequately compiling and analysing the data we receive. Next slide, please. So just to give you an idea of what that might look like, I'm going to show you a very brief overview of results. So in 2023, this year's member reporting exercise, based on the information we received, we understand that ICI members have covered just over half of the estimated 1.8 million cocoa-growing households in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana with child labour monitoring mediation systems. Which is clearly not yet our 100% target at all, but you can also see that progress has been made since 2021, where we were only at around 30%, rising to 35% in 2022, and then this last reporting period up to around half. So very similar to ECLT, we're certainly not there yet, but we can see tangible progress being made, which is really quite exciting. So yes, it's important to follow how that's going in order to see what's left to do, as well as to understand insights into how we can do what needs to be done even better. Next slide. And then more broadly, as I said, member reporting has enabled a better understanding of coverage and effectiveness of efforts across the sector. It's also given us really interesting insights into what's working well and what's lacking less well. We see that members from the very beginning have been motivated to share their efforts, but of course the collective definition of what and how to report that is a big need for effort to decide on what makes most sense, and also to make a manageable reporting form that equally doesn't include too much repetition, but provides the right level of granular detail as well. We had to invest a lot of time and effort as well into the designing of an appropriate reporting system, as well as all the safeguards that are necessary to ensure and build the confidence of our members in an increasingly litigious environment, particularly for US-based companies, for example. It's very, very challenging for them in some cases to report on some of the data we're asking. And then finally, what we can see is that the fact that we've introduced a reporting requirement has increased the visibility of efforts and results among some of our members. So we were hoping that it would push performance upwards, and we've seen that that is happening. So there's more of an interest being taken in what's being done, what's not being done. If you can't report, why can't you report? And helping that coverage to increase, but beyond coverage also to be helping the effectiveness of these systems to improve as well. And I think that's all. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Megan. It's very interesting to see that many of these challenges are shared, and that it's reassuring to see that we're dealing with the same challenges. But also, I understand that the learnings can be shared as well, and that much progress can be made in the future. So thank you for your hard work, and thank you for sharing your experience with us. We now can move to a couple of short videos that ECLT board members have prepared regarding the pledge. So I hope that you can hear the sound, and then we will move to the roundtable discussion.
I'm Simon Stain, independent expert member of the ECLT board. I've worked on child labour for 30 years in the trade union movement and in the ILO, lastly as ILO's senior advisor on fundamental rights at work. And I continue to advocate for social dialogue and for the rights enshrined in ILO conventions and in its Declaration on Fundamental Rights at Work. The ECLT pledge acknowledges that declaration, which proclaims the universal rights that enable people to claim a fair share of the wealth they've helped to create, freedom from child labour, forced labour and discrimination, and the rights to safe work and to freedom of association and collective bargaining. Despite our pledge to prevent child labour, the recent increase has been amongst the youngest children in family agriculture. Insufficient attention has been paid to root causes, family and community poverty caused by inadequate cash incomes and an inadequate social wage. To get back on track, all agriculture stakeholders, multinationals, governments, farmers associations and co-ops and rural workers unions must realise the pledged commitment to engage in dialogue and cooperate to create rural communities where adults have decent work and where children can thrive.
Hi, I'm Anthony Jackson, Senior Vice President, Group Agronomy for the Premium Group. I represent Premium on the board at ECLT. The Premium Tobacco Group were original signatories to the pledge, which was signed on the 18th of September 2014. The pledge of commitment aligns with our group, the Premium Group values, with regard to eliminating child labour in our supply chain. Our core origins are in 4 countries in Africa. We recognise that child labour is closely linked to socio-economic challenges. These challenges persist in Africa. Thus, child labour awareness and training programs are of paramount importance. We will continue in our endeavours to address child labour, and going forwards, we will continue to engage and support ECLT Foundation. Thank you.
I would like to thank Simon and Anthony for sharing those messages with us. So in a nutshell, yes, socioeconomic challenges are linked to child labor, and child labor awareness and training programs are of paramount importance. And then we as ECLT and our pledge, we acknowledge the Declaration of Fundamental Rights at Work and the ILO conventions, and our pledge is based on those pillars. So I would like to move forward to the roundtable discussion. So I would like to hear from Innocent and Megan on the experience of the ECLT Foundation and ICI respectively as MSIs, multi-stakeholder initiatives, on different issues such as transparency, accountability, and impact of voluntary commitments. So we have prepared 3 questions, which one of you will have 5 minutes to answer each question. And then if the other participants have comments or any other questions, please write them down in the chat box, and we will come back to them during the Q&A. So moving to question 1. So as a multi-stakeholder initiative, how do you ensure accountability and transparency amongst stakeholders or members? And what frameworks, either mechanisms or tools, guide your work in ensuring compliance amongst signatories and members? I know, Megan, that you already mentioned some of the accountability and transparency tools that you have, but it would be interesting just to hear from you a little bit more on that.
Megan, you want to go first or you want me to go first?
Oh, we cannot hear you, Megan.
And now can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. I'm happy to go first if that's okay. So as you mentioned, Victor, indeed the member reporting process is really a key way for us of ensuring this accountability among our members. Transparency is a little bit more complicated, but of course this is something that we expect to continue to improve over time, not least because of course there's a huge range of new legislation like CSDDD, which is increasingly requiring companies to be more transparent about what they're doing, as well as the results of what's happening. So in terms of ensuring that accountability, I think asking for regular reporting, making it something that can be done, but also ensuring that when it's being done, what's being asked is sufficiently specific and clear that different members are reporting on the same thing. You know, if it's very vague, do you have a commitment, yes or no? Okay. It's not very strong as a commitment. Whereas if as a result of your commitment you have done X, Y, and Z, that starts to be a little bit easier to ensure a greater level of accountability. So I think even though it's ended up with quite a long series of questions that we ask members to provide information on every single year, it is a way of ensuring that accountability to a greater degree. And I think what's also working at the same time is, on the one hand, a push for, and on one hand, a need for greater standardization of the different approaches that are being made, and so that people are actually reporting on the same thing in the same way, using the same definitions. And hopefully that will be pushing performance upwards across the sector as a whole. Over to you, Anissa.
Thank you, Megan. Yeah, to a large extent, that's I would have a similar response as yours, Megan. In ECLT, we are fortunate that as a multi-stakeholder initiative, our board members, the signatories of the pledge, are committed to transparency, so they've not placed any limits to what we can say, what we can publish or what we cannot publish regarding the pledge. So there are no limits to that. The questionnaire that we use, the tool that we use to assess for periodic assessments is available online. So it's publicly available. Anybody can have a look at it. And yeah, we compile the reports and we consolidate the information. And what is reflected in the report that we issue is really up to us. The board or the members do not say, okay, you cannot publish this or that. That's 100% up to us as a multi-stakeholder initiative. So that's one way of accountability. But there's also another one, which is really by making a public commitment. The members of the ECLT Foundation, the signatories of the pledge, have said, yeah, we are actually accountable to the world about how we're going to do about this. So they are also accountable for their performance to the outside world, and they'll be monitored, and that's why we have to issue these reports to show our progress. So that's also another accountability mechanism. By making these public reports public, by making the pledge public in itself, it's part of the pressure we are giving our members to say, hey, you have to continue to work on this. You have to show that you are improving. You have to continue to show that you're working on the right things in accordance with the public commitment, in accordance with the international law. Then internally, there is the board is formed what they call the Working Group on Pledge Realization, WGPR, a bit of a mouthful, but it means that within and we have put in place the structures so that members are accountable to each other as well as part of the pledge. The board is the custodian of the pledge. So if we go back with the report to the board and say, this is not working well, this is not, the board will be saying, we don't know who is not doing well because they get consolidated results, but they will be able to say, we want you as ECLT Foundation engage us individually to make sure that ABC is done and that the next report will show the, so that social control among its board members is also an effective way for ensuring accountability and transparency among the signatories themselves. So you can see that there's a public sort of accountability mechanism, and then there's also the internal or private accountability mechanism.
Excellent. And Megan, I had another question regarding the fact that the reporting is annual and that is mandatory. How was that perceived by your members? And I'm sure that for them is killing two birds with one stone, since the new CSDDD and due diligence is going to ask them to report more often. So it's I don't know if those reporting could be similar or I don't know. I would like to know a little bit more about that.
I mean, we tried to sell it in that way to say, don't worry, you're going to need to report this information anyway. So if we come up with something that makes sense in terms of what we should be reporting on and what you should be reporting on, then you do it once. I think some of them agree and disagree with us to a certain extent, but indeed some of the key indicators, like for example, coverage of CLMRS, are equally things that they have already made public targets on in many cases, as individuals as well as members of ICI. And equally, these are the things that they do publish in their sustainability reports on an annual basis. These are the same things which are being audited by external audits. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of convergence around some key indicators of action and of progress and of results, which in some cases are going to be the same numbers going forward. Something we've also tried to do, because of course we are one reporting process, but we're not the only one, as you rightly mentioned. So there are, in the cocoa sector, there are national platforms for sustainable cocoa in many different European countries. So for Switzerland, for Belgium, for Germany, for France now, and also for the Netherlands. And we've worked very closely with what's known as the ISCOs. So all these different national platforms to come up with a totally aligned reporting framework, which means that at least for everything that's child labour, an EICI member only needs to report once to us, and then we transfer the relevant information for our members who are also members of some of these national platforms, so that they only have to report once, but that we're looking in both setups at exactly the same indicators, managed in the same way, and that's been a really appreciated exercise by the people that profit from that, because of course that's limiting the number of reporting on similar things. It's increasing alignment. It's pushing not just among ICI membership, but across cocoa and chocolate stakeholders across European countries. For are we aiming for the same thing, and are we looking for the same results? So I see that as very positive.
Yeah, it's a great way to streamline the reporting and to try to optimize and not to duplicate efforts for each company. Great. I think we can move to question number 2. So how do you measure the impact of voluntary commitments on companies' behaviors and actions? And I know, Megan, that you mentioned that now commitments are mandatory, but yeah, I would like to see also how it became from voluntary to mandatory, and then what indicators demonstrate progress or areas for improvement.
Innocent, do you want to go first this time?
Yeah, I can go first. So for us, our questionnaire, when you are responding to the questionnaire, you just don't only answer yes or no. We also say it is mandatory that you provide the evidence of your claim. So if you are going to say I have a policy of commitment to eliminate child labor in my supply chain, then you have to either attach the policy itself to support your response, or you can provide a link to your website if it is already public on your website. So the fact that you have some evidence, or we are requiring this evidence, means that the respondents are not just making claims and just ticking the box. They are also having to provide additional information to validate what they are saying. For us, like I said earlier on, yeah, the impact of the pledge, most importantly, we want to measure it and what the companies do. Do they have the right policies? If they integrated those policies in their purchasing procedures, in their requirements for their suppliers, employees, and so forth, that's evidence of, yeah, you are moving beyond commitment to really integrating in your policies and procedures in your supply chain, and that when child labor happens in remediation, you have a well-documented process of how you address child labor, and that process is aligned with all the requirements of the ENGPs with regards to consultations of affected stakeholders and so forth. What we have also done over the years is, if you look at the first questionnaire, which we did in 2015, and you look at the second questionnaire, which we did in 2024, you will see that the first questionnaire, I think, we had something like 33 questions that we're asking. But now our questions are now over 40 questions. When we started way back in 2015, there was no blueprint really on how to do operational grievance mechanisms in smallholder agriculture. None existed. So we didn't know what was out there, how does it look like in smallholder communities. Operational grievance mechanisms were more like in formal factories and places like that that are more self-contained. So over the years, we've also been developing, as we have been learning more from the likes of ICI and others, we've been learning more about what is possible, and we've been improving our questionnaire to be asking more in-depth questions. The companies have also been learning a lot from their own experience, the experience of others, to improve their approaches to child labor, and we needed to evolve our measurement of impact together with the evolutions as well in knowledge from learning and also from emerging expertise.
Right. Megan, do you want to add something?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in many ways we obviously do quite similar things, but in some ways we go a little bit further. So it's going beyond saying, do you have a policy? Show us the policy. But it's also saying, tell us exactly the results of your policy. So the different things that we've asked our members to report on aim from, they're mainly output level, but they go from the overall coverage. So how many families and households do you consider to be within the scope of the efforts that you make? But then within that, okay, so how many children are we actually talking about? Then how many cases of child labor did your system identify? And already when you start to look at that, you can get an idea of the effectiveness of that system. So if we know what national prevalence of child labor is in the countries that we're looking at, and we know that only 1% of children covered by a CLMRS are being identified in child labor, to put it frankly, that means the CLMRS is rubbish. It's not possible that only 1% of children are being found in child labor in a context where we know child labor is around 40%. So this is challenging as well, because for us, a high number of kids identified in child labor means the system's working well, and that's something we should be celebrating. Of course, publicly reporting that you've identified thousands of kids in child labor is a little bit more difficult for some of our members, and for the average consumer to understand that actually this is a good thing rather than a bad thing. So this is why it can get a bit tricky. But yeah, already by looking at things like identification, asking ourselves what the identification rate looks like now, what it could be, and where we should be heading for, I think are really important things about measuring the quality of the implementation that's happening. Equally, going beyond, is there a remediation process in place, but rather, okay, how many of the kids identified received some sort of remediation? And we're able to see that the more detailed numbers have been improving year on year, which is really positive. Sometimes these systems are criticized by being big data gathering machines that do a lot of child labor surveys, but that don't deliver any support. We can see that that's decreasingly the case. More and more support is being provided through these systems to the children that need it because they've been found, and equally more and more preventative support is being provided to children too, to stop them ever being in a situation where they have to engage in child labor. So these things are things that we can capture through the reporting. Equally and we can even capture some degree of individual impact. So for example, we look at children who've been followed up at least twice. Yeah. And then we look at, okay, what proportion of those kids were still working when they were last followed up? So we can now report on and have reported on a withdrawal rate, if you like, which is great. But I would like to put that with some caveats, which is to say that when we look in detail at some of the numbers that we get, to me, those withdrawal rates look too high. So while it's great that we have that data, and while it's great that we have information coming from, okay, when you've identified a child, when you've followed up with a child, when you've seen how that child is doing further along, I take them with a pinch of salt. So our current feeling is that while it's fantastic to be able to capture coverage and to capture things that give us an idea of how implementation is going, to really understand what impact that's making for the sector as a whole, you need separate studies. Member reporting is one thing, and that's great, but you also need national prevalence surveys and other measures that you can do at regular intervals. Certainly not every year, there's no need to do that, but from time to time to be able to say, okay, what is the robust data on this happening? And if coverage is continuing to increase, then the likelihood of more and more children being able to receive support should be increasing too. But to really see if that impact is happening, then you need separate studies too. So I think member reporting is great and is important, but it's not the only way that we should be measuring impact. And there are better ways to do that independently as well.
Yeah, great. And giving also the tools to smallhold farmers and for them to be able to report on things. I remember in a couple of weeks ago when we jointly presented at the Business and Human Rights Forum with Better Cotton. I see Leila is online, but she mentioned that when they found farms where they know that there's child labor and that the farmers were sweetening the thing and saying no, there's no child labor here, that's an issue. So because we know that there is, and we would like the farmers to report it as well, and to have both a holistic approach of reporting the issue. And maybe Leila can share more insights in that during the Q&A. Then let's move to question number 3. So what does the future of accountability in global labor and human rights look like from your perspective? And what steps can or should multi-stakeholder initiatives take over the next decade to better address child labor in agriculture?
You want me to go first again, Megan? Or
Please do.
Yeah, I think from what it looks like at the moment, the rules are going to get more and more. We're going to give more and more regulations. They are going to be more and more mandatory. So we know that in this space of global and human, and we could also be talking about the possibility of a convention on business and human rights. We know that it is already in the works. So that's just the future that we have to live with, a situation of more regulation, more need for more accountability and transparency in how companies, multinational enterprises, some of whom are our members, are addressing these labor and human rights risks as well as environmental issues. So that is very clear. I think the challenge really for us is multi-stakeholder initiatives to move at an equally fast pace so that we are providing our members with the support that they need to be able to respond to all these external pressures. And also creating this platform, as Megan said, where, because I think with all the mandatory national regulations, international regulations or regional regulations, as you see with the EU, there is a bit of reporting fatigue going on. And the more that we can have one platform where members can report or companies can report, I think that will be quite be a huge improvement that will be needed. I think as multi-stakeholder initiatives, we have to move faster. By the nature of our organizations, we move at the pace of the slowest member, because we have to consider sometimes conflicting views, sometimes competing views, and things don't move as fast. But the regulatory environment is not stopping because we are negotiating and consulting internally. I think we need to be more agile as multi-stakeholder initiatives. We need to be moving further. I like what Megan they're doing in Coco, where they've gone as far as asking their members to capture what's happening in their supply chains, how many children have been reached, withdrawn, identified, and so forth. I think this is a step which, as a tobacco sector, we also need to discuss, because they are going to be reporting. They are reporting on this anyway, so they might as well just also use the ECLT as a platform for us to capture that kind of data. I think going forward, we see that as multi-stakeholder initiatives, Beta Cotton, ICIs, Bonsucro, others, and a whole lot of others in agriculture. We are working in a very difficult space where most child labor is found, 70% according to the last global statistics. Next year, maybe, who knows, it could be even more. Given what has happened with COVID, given what has happened with all these international conflicts, and at least in this sub-Saharan Africa region, what has happened with the price of inputs, which we know affects livelihoods, and also what has happened with regards to extreme weather events. So child labor could, by 2026, actually have doubled. At least those countries that have done surveys after COVID, child labor has actually doubled, like we saw in Uganda. Uganda is a bit of an exceptional case because they closed schools the longest, but it gives us an idea of where we could be. So how can we better work together to address child labor, given that this is a common challenge? Over the past 20 years, for the likes of ICI and ourselves, for our existence, we have worked separately. But look where this has taken the global child labor movement. We are really faced with a situation where child labor is increasing. So what's wrong in our approach? What's wrong with the ILO approach? What's wrong with the Alliance 8.7 approach? What's wrong with the international partnership for collaboration on cooperation on child labor in agriculture? We are too fragmented, and too many children are falling through the cracks. We have let them down. We are not going to meet the SDG 8.7 target. Therefore, going into the next global child labor conference in Morocco in 2026, I think we have to come up with ideas, especially for us who have been working in this space for more than 20 years, ICI, ECLT, BCI, and others. I think we need to meet and really say, guys, how should the global child labor strategy look like? How can we better work together so that we are going really to reverse this child labor, this increasing trend in child labor? Because the current approach has not taken us anywhere. If anything, more children are in child labor, and for us, this is a disappointment given the amounts of money that we have been able to mobilize from our members to address this problem. We need to be able, as multi-stakeholder initiatives, to show that our presence is making a difference, not only in company behavior, like you are seeing with the pledge, but also in the numbers of children who are having to work, number of families who are having to employ their children because they cannot afford the adult labor. How can we better work differently in the coming decade and beyond the SDGs in 2030 to improve the situation, to reverse the trend? So that's my challenge, more of a wish list, and sometimes even just thumb sucking on where things are going to go. But I would really wish that we work together differently, so that we have agriculture that is free of child labor. That's my wish and ambition.
How do I follow that? Other than expressing a wish that absolutely, I think there needs to be more joined up action, not just within multi-stakeholder initiatives, but also between multi-stakeholder initiatives. I very much agree with you, Innocent, that transparency needs to improve and increase. Legislation is absolutely on the increase, and then action needs to be taken by various different actors in global labor and human rights space to react to those changes to legislation, to do more, quite simply, because while efforts are improving and progress is being made, there's a great deal of room for further progress to be made. So that means more work for businesses, but also more work for governments. And I think we're going to see an increase in public-private partnerships, and we're going to see an increase in cross-commodity working. And I think the changes to legislation, especially the European legislation at the moment, are really pushing those kinds of things to happen. If child labour is going from one supply chain where steps are being taken to another one where there's less scrutiny, that's not good enough, and that's not going to change the global figures, as Innocent rightly says. And so I think as multi-stakeholder initiatives, it's very much our responsibility to support that shift towards more joined up thinking, towards more work in different origin countries, but also looking beyond child labour in specific commodities to child labour more broadly, and also placing that in a broader continuum of child rights, because these are not things that can be addressed on their own. They're rather things that it makes much more sense to address from multiple perspectives and looking at children's well-being overall, as opposed to just focusing on some of the negative aspects. And I think that's an easier call to action as well on the ground when we're implementing programs. If you're selling it as know something but not providing an alternative, that's much, much more difficult as selling something that's providing very tangible benefits to children and their families. So I think this is the general direction we're going to be going. And we need to be supporting our members to work together and to make more partnerships. And our various partners who are not necessarily members, especially governments, are well aware of that and want to be part of that discussion too.
Excellent. I see that we already have a few questions. So yeah, I'm sure people want to take the floor as well and ask some questions to our panelists. So there's I don't know if Simon Stein, do you want to ask your question, or do you have a comment?
Can you hear me, Victor?
Yes, we can hear you.
So sorry, this new app I had some problems installing this morning after a 20-hour delayed flight. So I just wanted to say, look, I agree with Innocent, and I think part of our discussion, maybe particularly in the last year or so, and since our board meeting earlier this year in Zimbabwe, has talked a lot more about sustainable prevention. And we've talked a lot about CLMRS, and we've talked about withdrawal and remediation. But I think we've known for probably 20 years, and certainly for the last decade, that prevention is the only way we're going to end child labour. We'll never, ever end it through withdrawal and remediation, not least because we tend to withdraw and remediate older children in worse forms of child labour who are disproportionately boys by that age, and we're not preventing the entry of the youngest children 5 to 11 years old, which is where all the recent increase of child labour has been, and it's been in family agriculture overwhelmingly. So if prevention is the strategy, or should be, and we should be collaborating together to ensure that better prevention. And if the main cause of child labour, as I said in my video message, is this functional dependence of family farms on the unpaid labour of their children because they don't receive an adequate income to replace the labour of their children with adults in decent work, what are the indicators that we are using to reflect preventive measures, and in particular, measures that ensure that families have an adequate cash income both for their own needs and to employ adults to do the work their children would otherwise be doing, and that the communities in which those families live have the shared social wage of free quality education, healthcare, water, and so on, that are also an essential part of community and family incomes. Now, the question is, how do we shift the emphasis to prevention, and how do we start talking about the elephant in the room, which I mentioned in my video piece, which is about how do we ensure that we create systems and support systems for dialogue in the value chain that enable small farmers, farmers associations, rural workers to negotiate a fair income from the wealth in the value chain that they've helped to create. What that seems to me that is essentially missing. And when I look at the list of stakeholders, what I don't see, apart from some of the larger farmers' organisations, I don't see rural workers' organisations, and I don't see institutional frameworks for social dialogue. In fact, perhaps less now than we might have seen 30 years ago. So what are we going to do about prevention, and how are we going to what indicators are we going to use, and how are we going to measure them? Thanks.
Yeah, Simon, so 100% agree that we have to turn off the tap, as you often say. So rescuing children that are already in child labor can only take us so far. But for as long as there are forces both at household level, both at the national economy and so forth, that is pushing more and more children into child labor, we know that then child labor will not decrease. Then secondly, I think we also know that prevention costs much more than, costs much less than if we're going to invest in withdrawal. It takes much more to work on withdrawing children, because you have to provide a lot of the things which children face before you even have started to tackle the root causes. So it just makes sense that we put more emphasis on prevention. As ECLT Foundation, our work, our programming includes, of course, supporting social dialogue. So yes, we are going to be doing some work at community level with drawing children and helping savings and so forth. But we know that without genuine, meaningful social dialogue, involvement of farmers associations, involvement of the companies concerned who are sourcing from those farmers, and of course the mediating role of government, without that being effective, we know that whatever we're doing at community level is just a band-aid solution. So we provide a lot of resources for social dialogue. This is not always easy. In some contexts, farmers are not as organized as we would like, and having that collective voice for them to be able to bargain, first of all, for a fair price of their commodity, and work together in collective marketing and so forth. In tobacco, there are very few contexts where we see that happening. I know that in cocoa that happens. But I think I can only agree with you that we need to be working on that. We need to do more on that. And that means governments also playing their role. I'm in Zimbabwe at the moment. And yesterday in the newspaper, they were saying that the minimum wage has been increased to $150, except for two sectors, domestic work and agriculture. And I ask myself, why are they leaving out agriculture? Why are they leaving out children in domestic work? So it means that we have also a lot of work to do with governments. That's why in our programming, it also includes, I know COCO does the same as well, it includes funding the ministries of labor to make sure that they have the capacity to not only coordinate, but also make sure that all the child labor laws and guidances which they provide are actually translated to meaningful actions and programs on the ground. Farmers know what is expected, and they receive the necessary support from not only government, but the companies that are working in their supply chain. So a lot more work to be done for sure, and that should be part of the agenda in Morocco, I would assume, that we should be calling for the international community, the donor community, even the countries in the global south to better support social dialogue, because often these are also the countries where social dialogue is very difficult because of very adversarial relationships between trade unions and government, for example. And yet these are the countries that really need that kind of collaboration and a spirited corps in order to eliminate problems such as child labor. So I think going to Morocco in 2026, this is our best chance to really push for this kind of genuine social dialogue as a way of helping child labor prevention and as the only path forward towards its elimination.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you.
Megan, would you like to add something?
I mean, as you say, the reality in cocoa is a little bit different to what we see in tobacco, but the focus on prevention remains absolutely paramount. As you rightly say, Innocent, it's much cheaper to prevent than it is to treat, and that's the case for pretty much every development issue, not only for human rights issues like child labour. The challenge is, of course, that in order to do proper preventative work, that's got to be done by governments, and it's got to be done in partnership with governments. And I think the remediation is easy, let's say, because you can put the responsibility much more on companies alone, whereas prevention can't be done by companies alone and shouldn't be done by companies alone. And I think this is where we need to be focusing efforts. I mean, the reality, and this is why I was talking about joined up working being so important earlier, the reality, at least in Cote d'Ivoire and in Ghana, is that however vulnerable cocoa growing households are and however vulnerable their children are to child labour, there's more child labour overall than there is child labour in cocoa. Child labourers in cocoa are more likely to be attending school than children who are not doing child labour in cocoa. So we have leverage through multi-stakeholder organisations like ICI, like ECLT, on some parts of some supply chains when they touch a global commodity. But we have much less leverage on the arguably more vulnerable kids who are suffering even more in terms of human rights abuses. But we have much less interest in their situation from a global point of view, because we don't have the leverage of large multinational companies with luxury commodities. And I think that's an important point to remember, which is that unless we work properly in a joined up way with governments, we're not going to be able to really do proper preventative work that's going to have the impact that is needed to have. And so our scope as individual multi-stakeholder initiatives on its own is pretty limited, but fully agree in terms of prevention, and we need to work in partnership to do that.
Great. I saw that there's another question. So somebody asked, I would like to inquire on if ECLT has achieved any promising sign on future success, especially some developing countries, in some developing countries, because it's like other than NGOs, some of us, the youth, have nothing like a safe space to join the fight on child labor.
All right, I think youth employment in agriculture, especially in the developing countries, is essential. It is essential because in most of the developing countries, you see that the youth unemployment is very high. The young population, children and people below 25 years of age. I know that in the Africa region, it can be close to 60% of the population being below the age of 25. So it's important that we create youth employment. And these countries, employment in the official sector is very limited. There are less and less employment opportunities. So that's number one. Number two, we see that the average age of farmers is also increasing. So we need to replace the aging farmers with youths. So we need more involvement of youths. But we want youth to participate in agriculture in a safe way. They must be performing decent work. They must know how to grow watermelon or cocoa or whatever else in a safe way. So part of our programming includes skills training, so that number one, those who are not inclined to go in agriculture have an alternative pathways to get a living. But secondly, those who are interested in agriculture know how to do the agriculture in the proper way. So it's part of our programming. Countries like Tanzania, in countries like Guatemala, we have done a lot of work and seen lots of success, including even Kyrgyzstan. We saw lots of success with the involvement of youths in skills, providing them with alternative skills, so that they can play an important role in agriculture if they are interested, or if they are interested in life outside agriculture, they can still do that, and that works to strengthen the household, their household, the economics of their household. When it comes to what role they can play in raising awareness on child labor, we have had some initiatives where we felt that I'll use the word using, but not in an exploitative way, but asking children to go and raise awareness on child labor to other children. So more like a peer-to-peer education and communication. We have seen that work very well in Uganda, where we formed what we called children's clubs. It worked very well. I think when children are communicating with adults, it's always more of one-way communication from the adult to the child. And there's no space for the child to ask, okay, you are saying I should not do this task. Why should I not do it? But I love to go and apply pesticides. The child will tell you that. But when there's that peer-to-peer communication, it is possible that children can be convinced to know what is in their interest, to continue with their education, to continue to be in school, to complete their education. So there are many opportunities, I would imagine, in projects where we are working as a foundation. What I would encourage you is to reach out to our email, eclt@eclt.org. Tell us in which country you are, and if we have a project that is in that country, we can always find ways to connect you with our implementing partners in those countries. And of course, we need more hands. So the more that you want to get involved, I think the better for everyone. So thank you very much for that question.
Thank you. I saw that there was a hand raised. Let me check. Is it Agostina?
Hi, Victor. Yes, thank you. This is Agostina from CNT. First of all, thank you, Megan and Innocent, for the insightful comments around child labor. First of all, we all know this is a very complex and interconnected issue that is going on. So I think cross-sectorial partnership is something very, very important to really tackle the root cause of this issue. So not only including governments, but also unions, as Simon said, and also the agriculture sector in general, let's say. Right holders engagement also for sure is something very important to really dialogue with them and see and take them into account when reporting and measuring our KPIs, to check if we are really impacting in the people we want to, and in a positive way, for sure. In this, talking about this, well, going back to the basis, I think being transparent and accountable is very important, and by this building trust, so we can be transparent and talk about it. I think it's also a very important topic.
Indeed, I agree with you. Like our colleague Leila from BCI was saying sometime last week, I think we should get to a stage where if a company reports that we had 2,000 cases of child labor in our supply chain, that should not be something to be ashamed of. Rather, it shows that you have systems in place to identify children, to detect child labor, and your systems are working. Because if you report there's only one child, we know that in these communities, small scale, older agriculture, children are working from as young as 5 to 11 years. That's what the ILO statistics are telling us. That most of the child labor are not children employed in big commercial farms and for salaries. These are children who are just going with their mother, with their father to the fields, and they just take part in agriculture. So agriculture is the entry point. And what we see is that these are very young children, which no one in their right conscience, and most parents have the right conscience, are not going to ask these children such an age to work, but they do work because it's just part of the family culture. So I think in this age of transparency, companies should not be ashamed. Companies should not be shamed, and companies should not be punished either by way of some economic incentives by their customers and so forth for showing that there's child labor in their supply chain. I think that mental shift is needed at many levels because we know child labor occurs, and the more we are shaming and punishing companies for being transparent, the more we are pushing the problem underground, and that is not good for children. I think we need this mental shift in order that, we are putting in place due diligence systems to uncover these things. And we should not be hiding them because we know they exist, and there should be no shame or some form of punitive economic consequences on a company that shows that its systems are working. So I can only agree with you more, but I think we need a big shift in the mindset, not only of the companies themselves, but also your customers and also even the public. They should not punish those companies who are transparent about their performance, who are transparent about what they are finding, and are showing clear signs that they are addressing the problem, even though they are not completely there yet.
Hi, yes, it's Leila here. I'm jumping in. Thank you very much for referencing what I just mentioned the other week. I feel like in this room, we're very much preaching to the choir. I couldn't agree more with the previously made statements. And just on our end, I represent Better Cotton on the call, and we have several crops on, participating in today's meeting. And it is important. Sometimes we cover different geographies, and sometimes we overlap. And it is really important that we speak with one voice when we address the government, when we speak with our members. Our membership may be diverse, but for instance, in cocoa, the supply chain will be a lot shorter and the traceability is a lot more possible. So indeed, the companies are a lot more engaged directly with the farmers, are a lot more visible and present at farm level, comparatively speaking. When it comes to cotton, the supply chain is so long and convoluted, and it's so expensive to do full traceability. And while we're doing that, sometimes I'm worried that we may lose the forest for the trees, and get distracted by the process of traceability, which is just that, a process, and forget and same with due diligence, and forget to what end we are requiring it, right? To bring us closer to the farm, to help us learn about the issues at the farm. Well, MSIs like ours, we are already at the farm, and we are already able to tell what's going on, and that we are seeing child labor. And with this changed approach of engaging the producers and removing this vilification of, if you find child labor, you're out, you're denied a license, or you're reprimanded in some way, and actually getting them like, okay, so what are we doing about it? We can tell that story, we can engage them, we can show already what's happening on the ground. We need a collective effort. We need to bring businesses and as well, bring them closer in dialogue with government to actually start working on remediation. And here, cotton supply chain would very much benefit from linking arms with food supply chains that have a shorter chain, but the same message, to say, just let's start working on this together. Let's act together. It's not going to be as scary to step in front of the crowd and say, I have child labor. If there are a lot more organizations or businesses joining you in that statement, and they're not just coming from one crop, so that we don't vilify a single crop, but it is really a situation and the truth across crops, across agriculture, across geographies, and everyone is there in the same boat. And our voices are going to be amplified if we're doing this together across crops and businesses. Yes, thank you. That's my 2 cents in the mix. Thank you so much for today's meeting.
Thank you, Leila. We have another question. How can we encourage companies to communicate their commitments and results more transparently in the context of increasing media attention and legislation?
I mean, I can have a go at that one.
Oh, please.
If you fancy. I mean, I think we really need to work on the content of the legislation. Quite simply. What's happening currently in Europe so far will encourage companies to report transparently. What's happening in the US does not. If a company writes that a single case of child labor or of forced labor has been found in their supply chain, that can be the start of an import ban, especially for forced labor, or a court case. And understandably, some companies are very scared about that possibility, which takes an enormous amount of time and effort and money that could be invested in other activities, and notably for prevention and other kinds of sustainability work. So if we can advocate and work with policymakers to ensure that the content of legislation has this supportive focus rather than a punitive one, it will do exactly as Leila said and not drive the problem underground, but rather to encourage this transparency so that solutions can be found and so that proactive work can take place to prevent and address human rights issues, rather than pretending they don't exist, because it would be too dangerous for a business to do so. So I think really working with the policymakers to make sure that legislation follows the spirit of the UN guiding principles.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think that's the only way. I think right now the legislation is really focused, especially in the US. We've seen that in Malawi, where there have been cases of reported cases of forced labor through the tenancy system. That I think in a few years ago, the import ban was placed on tobacco from Malawi. And that's not the right approach. I think it's really very, very retrogressive, and it's not encouraging more transparency. Neither is it helping to address the problem that is really pushing people to go into these tenancy relationships. It's not also really helping the engagement with governments, because they are just going to put in place a law and say we have done our job without really providing the necessary support to farmers and farming communities to ensure that the problems are, number one, identified, resolved where they are ongoing, and that the root causes are addressed. And often what we are seeing with this very punitive legislation is that no support whatsoever is being given to these governments, is being given to these countries, is being given to multi-stakeholder initiatives working in those industries to address the issues. So it's just an import ban. It comes and it takes effect tomorrow. They don't care about what happens to those farmers who are stuck with a crop sometimes which they cannot eat. They don't care. And so there needs to be a human face behind the regulation, and understanding that all parents wish the best of their kids, and they would not be sending kids to work unless there was something that was forcing them to do so. We need to understand that and support parents and families to close those gaps, to close those, to address those root causes before we can even talk about any punishment or punitive action.
Indeed. Simon, do you want to share your comment? I think it goes in the,
Yeah,
in the
thanks. I
same
mean,
sense.
I thought this last bit of discussion was really much more, well, was increasingly positive and thoughtful. I mean, there are two things that come to mind. First of all, I mean, I take Megan's point, but I think, you know, there has been a tendency in some of the discussion in the last few years to talk almost exclusively about social protection, government social security, as somehow the magic bullet that replaces the poverty that is created in value chains by this unequal sharing of wealth. And governments can do a lot of things. They can support better productivity through good public agricultural extension services, all sorts of measures. But they can't replace the responsibility of the big brands and companies to be prepared to negotiate fair shares of wealth within the value chain. They're not able to do that. They can't become unless they set prices and wages and enforce them by law. They can't replace free bargaining of price and income between producers and workers and those further up the value chain. Nor can they provide the required preventive public services unless they have the necessary tax base. And that's also a question about the tax base that comes from a more formalised agricultural sector, including small farmers, but it's also about where wealth is added in the value chain in countries on which tax is paid or only after export. So I think those are important points to make. And I think one of the points that Megan made, which was about children in cocoa-grown families more likely to go to school. Well, yes, most children in child labour actually attend school for some of the time at least. But everything we know about the combination of child labour and education is that it doesn't provide good educational outcomes. Combining the two doesn't provide us with doesn't provide children with the outcomes they need, nor does it provide the development of a national skills base that that companies need for economic and social development. One of the last things I wanted to say, Victor, was this last bit of the conversation about the road to Morocco makes me think that maybe in the coming months we might find an opportunity for another gathering of the MSIs and others, perhaps, to talk about the common ground we have on the road to Morocco, about what we want to see coming out of the next Global Child Labour Conference, specifically with regard to how we get back on track and reverse the very serious deterioration we saw already between 2016 and 2020 on child labour in agriculture, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, a reversal or a regression that I can only say I think we all expect to be shown to be much, much worse in the period 2020 to 2024 because of the pandemic, because of conflict, because of the climate emergency. So we're facing almost a perfect storm. But the goodwill and the common ground that I think has been expressed today makes me think that maybe we should arrange another meeting to discuss the common ground to get the best outcomes we can from Morocco and real pledges to continue the cooperation amongst us that we're going to need to develop if we're going to make really any progress again. So that's my closing comment for today, but thanks very much for letting me speak again.
Thank you, Simon. I don't think there are any more questions. Does anybody else want to add a comment or a question? Otherwise, I think we're coming to a close of the webinar. So I would like to share a few thoughts on the road ahead. Also, I would like to thank our panelists and everybody who has contributed to this discussion. So your participation really underscores the strength of our collective commitment to combating child labor in agriculture. So over the past decade, the ECLT pledge has served as a cornerstone for collaborative efforts, impacting policies, practices, and most importantly, lives. However, the current child labor trends and statistics, as we were discussing, remind us that there is still much work to be done ahead. So in that sense, the ECLT Foundation, we are outlining three specific and critical pillars, and we want to focus as we move forward. So one is the prohibited task for children in tobacco growing and in agriculture. As Michiel was saying at the beginning, we really want to emphasize our support on these three initiatives. And the second pillar is establishing an industry standards and effective collaboration channels, and to improve the standards, practices, and capabilities on child labor across the whole tobacco industry and in agriculture. And the third one is, as we mentioned, it's living income. So to support activities to help tobacco growers achieve a living income and a decent standard of living. Obviously, collaboration will also need to extend to other crops and regions, and amplifying our impact and setting a precedent for global standards in agriculture. I believe that the roadmap ahead is ambitious, but it is also achievable with your continued commitment, innovation, action, and collaboration. This commitment to progress is exemplified by the ECLT Foundation's comprehensive approach to tackling child labor. And in the report that we're launching today and that I invite you to download, it's titled 10 Years On, Reflecting on the ECLT Foundation Pledge and Defining the Road Ahead. We highlight the Foundation's effort to combat child labor in agriculture and our priorities for the next decade. As we have heard today, since 2014, the Foundation and its contributors have worked to strengthen policies, conduct due diligence, and collaborate with stakeholders to address the root causes of child labor. We're excited to launch the report today, and we urge you to engage with the ECLT Foundation and leverage our insights and expertise to accelerate progress by corporate actions against child labor. So for details, insights, please scan the QR code that you see on your screen and read the full report. Or you can also visit the ECLT's website or social media channels where we'll be launching the report this week. This webinar is now coming to an end. Let us leave today with a renewed sense of purpose and determination. The challenges we face may be great, but so too is our collective ability to overcome them. Every policy improved, every practice changed, and every child protected represents a step forward, a brighter future. Thank you for your unwavering dedication and support. Let's continue to work together to turn these plans into progress and these goals into realities. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Innocent. Thank you, Michiel. And thank you all the participants that shared your insights and questions. And have a lovely rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.
Many thanks, Victor. Bye-bye.
Thanks to all. Bye.